Welcome back. You're listening to our panel discussion in recognition of National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Cybersecurity versus data security, government's two-pronged challenge, sponsored by Cloudera on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm Jason Miller, your host. Our guests today are Barron-DiCamillo, the Director of U.S. CERT at the Homeland Security Department, Bill Lay, the Deputy Chief Information Officer for Information Assurance and Information Security Officer at the Department of State, and Dr. Ron Ross, a Fellow at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Now, before break, we were talking a little bit about this idea of risk-based approach, bringing the mission people in. But the other piece of this is making decisions around roles and responsibilities. Who has the right to see what data, when to see that data? And then, again, going back to the cyber sprint piece that I think Bill brought up, the cyber sprint really focused on privileged users versus unprivileged or more, I guess, generally speaking, users. So let me start with Ann. The idea of roles and responsibilities, is that something that agencies are starting to head down based on what happened with the cyber sprint, based on the benefits it brings and what can be secured, what they saw through OPM cyber breach?
Definitely. I think, as we all are well aware, the OPM breach caused significant damage, but it also prompted significant federal action to mitigate future mass breaches against other federal networks and departments. So fueled by the increased funding from agencies, specifically around the cybersecurity spending, they implemented the 30-day cybersecurity sprints. It was launched in June in the wake of the OPM breach, and really with a focus on strong authentication. And so the goal was to implement strong authentication, two-factor authentication across the department. And because of the increased attention and increased focus effort, they were able to go from 42% to 72%, which is a 30% increase in that 30-day sprint. That shows a huge effort when you're thinking about departments and agencies to be able to accomplish that kind of a number in that short of a time. So it definitely shows you the importance of that this breach has taken on across cybersecurity implications, cybersecurity controls. I know from Department of Homeland Security, U.S. CERT, we've been pushing the top 5 controls for quite a while, along with a lot of our international partners. And one of those controls that we're constantly pushing is reducing administrative privileges as well as two-factor authentication. So it was good to see a consolidated effort deriving out of an event like that across the government.
And just to be clear, when you talk about two-factor authentication or strong authentication, it's basically the idea of, for agencies, maybe not everybody, but many people in agencies using those HSPD-12 PIV cards, the secure identity cards to log on to the network or at least onto specific applications.
But I think from our perspective, that's a capability. That's the implementation of a capability. So we're really focused agnostically, two-factor authentication across all of our constituencies and stakeholders. We want to ensure that the larger community beyond just the .gov understands the importance of this. As a typical home user, I should be leveraging something beyond just a username and password when I'm accessing my banking information. And so trying to evangelize that message from these events that happen where we see username and passwords that are being easily cracked and stolen credentials. So leveraging that and ensuring that, one person's event or incident becomes somebody else's prevention.
Bill, let me turn to you. State Department has been ahead of the game in many regards when it comes to cybersecurity. What did this cyber sprint in many ways do for you guys, and how did it bring you back to that focus on risk-based approach, but also data security?
Historically, we've used the HSPD-12 PIV card primarily for physical access, not logical access. It's difficult to get a smart card to work in a mobile or a remote environment. Through the 30-day sprint, though, we really have redoubled our efforts, and we are deploying the HSPD-12 PIV card both domestically and overseas. The emphasis initially, per the 30-day sprint from OMB, is on privileged users, but we are working to, by the end of this calendar year, have all of our users on our unclassified SBU network using a level 4 credential, which is a smart card.
And I think one of the things about that is once you get that piece in place, you can move to a single sign-on, which then roles and responsibilities can follow, meaning Bill Lay has access to these types of applications, to this type of data, can look at it but can't change the data or can change and look at the data. Is that where state and maybe some of your other colleagues, when you talk throughout the government, is heading?
Absolutely. The The two-factor authentication using the smart card is just the first step. That gives us an enabler or a means to go beyond just authentication and have a better control set for authorization, digital signatures. It really opens the door for a whole lot of additional technologies we could leverage.
Ron, must be kind of music to your ears in many ways. This is something that you and I have talked about over the years. NIST has been calling for, through their guidance and other things, other special publications. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing from a government-wide perspective and the difference that this can make not only for user access, but of course data security.
Well, the cyber sprint has been excellent to, as Bill says, to sharpen our focus. But I go back a long time in this business as you do, and we remember the Veterans Administration when they had the laptop and the hard drive, and then it was all about full disk encryption, and everybody was focused on that. I think what we're trying to see is taking a step back from all these individual breaches and looking at ways we can institutionalize processes that will allow us to make risk-based decisions that involve the right stakeholders, making the right investment decisions. And going back to what Ann talked about, the attack surface is getting broader and bigger every day. That's a function of our thirst for the new technology. And that technology is compelling to use. It makes us more productive. It's great to be able to take advantage of all of that great technology. But at the same time, one vendor's new feature is an adversary's increased attack surface. And so when we talk about one of the cyber sprint initiatives is identifying high-value assets, that's a great opportunity to look at not just how you value the assets from an impact perspective, but what does the adversary think about that asset? And when you go back to that perspective and you get the right stakeholders involved, talking about the OPM breach, for example, you have two different competing interests there. On one hand, on that system that was involved in the background investigation, that big database, there are investigators out there collecting data. They want to be able to collect that data, provide it back to the adjudicator so they can issue clearances, and they want to maximize the security clearance process. On the other hand, there are stakeholders that are not necessarily sitting in OPM that are that's their data that's going in to be adjudicated. So if you look at the Defense Department or the IC, the intelligence community, if they have information in that database and they are stakeholders and they're brought in to say what does the protection scheme look like for this particular database? We harden the target. Are we going to use two-factor? Is that going to be the direction we go, or is passwords going to be used? Those decisions then, when you look at it from the different stakeholders' perspectives, looks much different. And I think that it may cause different decisions to be made on those high-value assets at the right time, the right place. So that's where our engineering guideline is going to go. It's involving stakeholders early in the process. When you're first describing what the mission or the business is all about, and who are all the people that have an interest in us being successful in carrying out that mission or that business. And sometimes it goes beyond the particular agency where that system resides.
A couple of things that have come up several times, a couple of key phrases, attack surface. And let me turn to you. We keep talking about the attack surfaces getting larger. But going back to the original concept of what we're talking about here today is data security. Isn't that why the data security piece is so important, because of this attack surface keeps growing?
Yeah, we call it the what is old is now new again, or there's really no new normal, or this is our new normal. So the attack surface is getting larger because, as Dr. Ross said, we continue to want to leverage more and more of the automation, the more connected networks. And so as department agencies, we have to ensure that as we're connecting these assets to these networks, that we're looking at it from a perspective of resource management as well, and that somebody's device is going to have the same kind of protection mechanisms as their laptop. And, if they're leveraging their own home computer, making sure that as they're getting access to your network data in whatever fashion or form that is, that the mechanism to access that data is secure, no matter if they're coming from their own laptop or from our mobile device. And so and that's what we mean by the increased attack surface, is that we want to ensure that department agencies and end users have the ability to do their business at all hours of the day from all places around the world, as State Department has done for many, many years successfully. And so as we see our users leveraging this larger internet access capabilities, we want to ensure that we're still protecting the high-value assets, that we've identified those, that if I'm a user that needs access to that the controls are put in place, that as I access that from wherever I am, that I'm doing that in a way that's not going to impact the integrity of that data.
And you didn't even bring up the whole IoT, Internet of Things. That's a whole different conversation we could have. Ron, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted just to add to what Ann was saying. When you look at, for example, we have lots of data today, big data and all these different databases that are growing by the day. One of the things when you do that stakeholder analysis is that it's very rare where a single user has to have access to the entire database at one time. So one of the lessons learned, I think, from the OPM breach is that, doing a better job at architecting and engineering our networks and having these large data stores, even if you have to take those off the network where they're not directly accessible. Sure, you want to have the data for the adjudicators and the people who are working on a very small slice. It's called a view of that database. But there are lots of different techniques that we can use that can make the vast majority of that very valuable data totally inaccessible to adversaries. And that's the second part of our objective. You want to harden the target where the target is the system. And then assuming that some of the adversaries will get in, because we have lots of empirical data to show that's the case now, the second thing we have to do is to limit the damage they can do. So can you walk off with 21 million records, or do you walk off with a couple of thousand records? There's a real difference there, and that's an architecture and engineering issue that we have to confront, I think.
Bill.
Just want to emphasize the point he's making. What we're finding is architecture is really becoming fundamental for cybersecurity. And it's not just about having an inventory, and it's not just about planning how to build your IT infrastructure. It's about designing for a capability set so you're managing the assets, it's not managing you. What we're finding is that in the past, when we talked about FISMA and describing our systems, it was about establishing a boundary. What do your systems touch? Well, our infrastructures have become so wide-ranging and more complex, it touches everything. And so it really does come down to architecting and planning up front so you have a chance of securing it. Without that, you've lost the cause already.
Just what Ann said, what goes around comes around. What's new is old is new again. Architecture goes back to the architecture. Let's take a quick break. You're listening to the panel discussion, Cybersecurity versus Data Security, Government's Two-Pronged Challenge, sponsored by Cloudera, on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.